Sometimes ordinary homes hide extraordinary secrets. What begins as a small nagging detail can grow into something far greater than anyone expects. For one family, it started with sounds in the wall that seemed harmless, even easy to dismiss. Yet those simple noises marked the beginning of an unforgettable journey. Their curiosity led them to something no one expected, something hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The truth behind those sounds didn't just surprise them, it changed the way they saw their home forever. Stay with me for the full story, because it all began one quiet night with an unexpected sound. It began quietly, almost too quietly. The house was still, the kind of silence you notice only after the last light clicks off. When the homeowner lay down, he expected nothing more than the usual end of a long day. Then it started. A faint scratching near the headboard. So soft at first, it could have been his imagination. He froze, listening. Houses make sounds, sure. Wood shifts, pipes breathe, floors creak. But this wasn't that. The scratching had rhythm. It came, paused, came again. Not steady, but deliberate, like something small testing its way through the dark. Each scrape felt alive. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was wind brushing branches against siding or the furnace nudging to life. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, something almost everyone does when confronted with the strange inside their own walls. But no matter how many times he repeated those thoughts, the sound didn't fade. It lingered, soft but unrelenting. Every time he let his body sink down toward rest, a new tap or faint drag started up again. The more he listened, the less it sounded like the structure settling. It began to feel like movement, intentional, present. He shifted in bed, pulling the pillow tighter, pressing his ear in the other direction. Nestled in the stillness, the sound almost seemed louder. It came in bursts, suggesting something roaming just behind the sheetrock, trapped and stubborn. The irregularity made it worse. Had it been steady, he could have forgiven it. But unpredictability carries its own weight in the dark. The night stretched on that way, minutes feeling like hours. He weighed the thought of getting up, of flicking on a light and tearing back the wall panels, or at least stepping outside to check for branches. But the inertia of comfort held him in place. Investigating meant effort, disruption. Staying meant pretending it wasn't real. And pretending felt easier, at least for tonight. So he stayed put, aware of every scrape, every pause, every mild thud within the wall. The feeling of being observed settled in, the uncanny sense that the quiet of the room wasn't shared alone. He kept telling himself morning would clear the doubt, that it would look different in the daylight. This is how many strange stories begin, not with bold discovery, but with hesitation, not by action, but by holding still. The difference between a normal night and an extraordinary one can hinge on the decision to open a door, to look closer, or to turn over and shut your eyes. For him, in that moment, sleep finally won over fear. Yet even as he drifted into uneasy dreams, the thought pressed close. Something had unsettled the silence of his home. He didn't know it yet, but that scratch would not let him sleep again. The next morning arrived quietly, almost reassuring in its normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the windows, the coffee pot hissed and dripped, and the floor gave its usual creaks underfoot. The ordinary rhythm of the day seemed to wrap itself around the homeowner like a shield. As he moved through his routine, pouring a cup, scrolling his phone, organizing thoughts for the day, The uneasy memory from the night before began to feel softer, like a half-forgotten dream. Still, something held on at the back of his mind. That scratch. Not loud, not menacing, but persistent. When he walked back to the bedroom later, curiosity tugged again. He leaned close to the drywall and pressed an ear against it. Nothing, just silence. That silence should have put the matter to rest, but it didn't. It gnawed in a quieter way, whispering that the night before hadn't been imagined. That's when the excuses kicked in. A squirrel skittering outside, the furnace whispering as it cycled off, or maybe even a mouse somewhere in the walls. He lined up these possibilities and stacked them neatly, using them like bricks to wall off any thought of something stranger. Practical, believable answers always feel safer than opening yourself to mystery. Have you ever convinced yourself not to look, because looking might only make things worse? The truth was, he wanted to keep things ordinary. Pulling at loose threads might unravel the whole fabric of the comfort he'd built in that house. If the sound turned out to be pests, then traps and poison would follow. If it came from something mechanical, then repairs and repairs meant bills. Worst of all, it could demand breaking open pieces of the wall, letting in disruption, dust, and days of inconvenience. And so he chose stillness instead. He told himself, better to sleep than dig into trouble. That decision wasn't laziness, but self-preservation. In his mind, ignoring the anomaly meant keeping control. The house remained whole, stable, unthreatened, at least in appearance. The fan could hum at night, drowning little noises, or maybe earplugs would provide enough distance between him and the scratching. A man can convince himself of almost anything if it lets him close his eyes in peace. But choices like that always leave residue. The sound might have disappeared, but the memory of it now carried more weight than the silence in the morning. The refusal to investigate wasn't an ending, it was a pause, an uneasy truce between comfort and curiosity. And whether he admitted it or not, avoiding the question had changed something already. Ignoring it bought him calm for a brief stretch of time. Yet every refusal has its consequence. In this case, looking away didn't close the mystery. It only shaped what would come next, because in the nights that followed, the quiet wouldn't hold. That second night, the homeowner slid into bed with a sense of determination. He convinced himself the strange disturbance had been a one-time fluke, stress, fatigue, maybe even an overactive imagination. To stack the odds in his favor, he built an intentional calm around himself. Screens shut off early, curtains pulled tight, the room blanketed in darkness. For the first hour, silence held. He relaxed, inch by inch, reassured by the quiet, reassured that the strange memory might already be behind him. Then it returned, the scratching, not soft or hesitant this time, but louder, sharper. It carried insistence, every scrape burrowing directly into focus. And as he sat there listening, another sound surfaced. A measured tapping mixed in with the scraping, rhythmic, deliberate, repeating in a way that felt almost coded. What unsettled him most wasn't just the sound itself, but the way it seemed to match him. He shifted in bed. The scratch went still. He breathed quietly. The tapping started up again. He rustled his sheets. It answered, almost on cue. These weren't random creaks of wood or hums of old pipes. It felt like something aware of him, just beyond reach, on the other side of the wall. The longer it continued, the stronger the impression grew. Not mechanical, not accidental. The pattern struck him as alive, even deliberate. Unable to ignore it, he peeled himself from bed and pressed a palm flat against the cool drywall. The vibration met him faintly, not constant, but enough to sense movement. The origin centered low and close, a small section of wall that suddenly seemed larger than the rest of the room. Each pause created unbearable stretches of quiet. But just when relief began to build, the scraping surged again, steady enough to prove it was no trick of hearing. This was direct, localized, consistent in a way his earlier excuses could no longer support. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't tiredness. It wasn't anything he could easily explain away, and as he stood there with his hand on the wall, the line between sleep and wakefulness felt thinner, replaced by raw awareness. The silence outside the wall only heightened how alive it was inside. Minutes felt longer. Every sound dragged him closer toward the truth he had resisted the night before. Denial, once so comforting, thinned under the weight of evidence now pressing against the thin barrier of drywall. His thoughts chased the same question over and over. What was sharing this space with him? What had taken root just inches from where he slept? The refusal to investigate was no longer possible. Avoidance had broken. He needed to know. Pause there for just a moment. Imagine standing in that room, hand pressed to the wall, heartbeat climbing to keep pace with the sound. Then ask yourself the same question he did, in the dark of that second night. What was actually inside his wall? And when he sat down the next morning, that question lingered so strongly it could no longer remain his alone. By the following morning, he knew keeping the experience to himself wasn't enough. He mentioned it over coffee, his voice measured, like someone testing the weight of a story before laying it out. At first, she shrugged it off. Old homes make noises, after all, and offered the same explanations he'd used to quiet his own doubts. Pipes, wind, wood shifting. But when night fell, she stayed awake beside him, determined to listen. The scratching didn't keep them waiting long. The moment it stirred, her reaction shifted. She sat up sharply, eyes wide, the casual dismissal from that morning gone without a trace. "I hear it," she whispered. In that instant, disbelief cracked. It wasn't just his imagination anymore. It was happening. And now 2 sets of ears confirmed it. The next day, the family widened the circle. They asked the children if they'd noticed anything strange. Both nodded. One described a sound like tapping. The other said it was scratching to get out. Simple words, but both recognitions carried weight. These weren't random mutterings. They matched what he and his spouse had already experienced. Suddenly, the mystery was no longer his problem, no longer theirs as a couple. It belonged to the household. Each family member leaned into their own explanation. The spouse clung to the idea of pipes adjusting to temperature. One child insisted a small animal had gotten trapped in the walls. The other child leaned into imagination, hinting at something stranger, something they all agreed was unlikely but couldn't entirely dismiss. Different theories, but underneath them was the same reality. The sounds were real. Everyone had heard them. That night, they tried a small experiment, something simple that could prove or disprove the sense of intention behind it all. The homeowner rapped on the wall, 3 firm knocks in quick succession. For a heartbeat, silence lingered. Then came the reply, 3 distinct taps from inside the wall. He knocked again, with a different rhythm. Once more, the wall answered back, mirroring the beat. When he knocked, something knocked back, 3 taps. That changed everything. And just as unnerving was the way the sounds shifted through the house. At first, they seemed fixed to the bedroom wall. Minutes later, the same scratching appeared from further down the hallway, as though whatever was inside could move freely through hidden passageways of wood and plaster. Sometimes they even heard the faint scrapes near the living room, drifting from one end of the house to the other, as though mapping routes they couldn't see. Now it was real, and they all wanted answers. The experience had moved beyond unease and into action. With the whole family involved, the strange noises had become not just a private worry, but an undeniable presence shaping the rhythm of their days and nights. And so, with nerves sharpened and curiosity outweighing denial, they reached the point they could no longer put off. Something was inside those walls, and the time had come to look for it with purpose. They gathered in the living room one evening, aware that waiting and wondering wasn't enough anymore. A sense of resolve circled through the group as they decided to structure their nights with a purpose. They weren't trained investigators, they had no special instruments, but they had ears, patience, and each other. The method they chose was simple. When the noises stirred after dark, they stationed themselves along the wall and compared notes. One in the bedroom, another near the hallway, sometimes someone further down near the living room. Phones buzzed quietly as they whispered updates. Louder here, fainter there. Same rhythm. Piece by piece, they tried to trace the shifting path of whatever lived behind those walls. To keep track, they armed themselves with rolls of painter's tape. Whenever a scratch or tapping seemed clear, they placed a small X at that spot. Over several nights, a cluster of marks built up, gathering on one section of the interior wall near the center of the house. The sight was striking. No longer just random sounds, but a visible map of activity slowly emerging across the plaster. What amazed them was the regularity. Logs were kept, noting when the sounds began, how long they lasted, and when they would fade. Patterns surfaced. The noises tended to spark after the household had gone quiet for the night, almost as though waiting for silence. They grew in strength for 20 minutes, then dipped, only to rise again later. Predictable, but still unsettling in their persistence. Nights that had once been filled with TV shows, books, and easy conversation shifted into focused listening sessions. The living room lights dimmed, and the family gathered near the wall to sit in patient silence. The children saw it almost as play, taking turns at listening or jotting down entries into their growing log. But it was more than just play. Every new tape mark was a clue. Every reply of a knock built the sense that they were learning something hidden. It was in these quiet sessions that their role changed. They were no longer passive, waiting for the unknown to unsettle them. They were a team hunting an answer. What had begun as a strange burden slowly turned into something uniting, giving them shared purpose. With each night came the feeling that they weren't drifting aimlessly through confusion, but closing in on something solid, something that could finally be explained. Even without answers, they carried themselves differently now. The house felt less intimidating when faced together. Every detail mattered more: the timing, the location, whether the sound dragged or tapped, louder or fainter. They knew they hadn't solved it yet, but they had converted uncertainty into process. As the days stretched into weeks, their wall of tape told a story, though an incomplete one. They were narrowing possibilities, focusing attention, but no single conclusion yet fit. The evidence pointed somewhere, but it wasn't clear where. And so the question pushed forward into the next stage. If careful listening alone couldn't explain it, what explanations were even possible? They started trying to frame what this could be, tossing out every guess they could manage. They read forum posts, compared experiences, and argued late into the night about what fit and what didn't. Was it rodents? Insects? Pipes or vents that shifted with temperature. Even electrical wiring was mentioned. All of it seemed possible at first, but then the pattern would come again. Steady, timed, too deliberate, and the theories would collapse. Often, noises do come from animals or pipes. Scratches, squeaks, clanks, and thuds are part of life inside a home. But none of those explanations sat right here. There were no droppings tucked into corners, no chewed wires, no signs of moisture or leaks, no failing appliances. Everything across the house worked as it should. And yet, the tapping remained. Precise, rhythmic, stubborn. The family didn't give up. Each possibility was given a fair check, tested as best as ordinary people could test them. They had the furnace inspected, looked for nests, ran water through the plumbing just to listen. But every effort ran into the same wall. Nothing matched. The more they eliminated, the stranger it felt. One night, in the middle of another session of careful listening, one of the children broke the tension with a half-joking remark about ghosts in the walls. It brought out nervous laughter, brief relief. But under the laugh sat the same discomfort the adults already felt. Even if no one in the family believed it seriously, the joke clung to the edges of their thoughts, refusing to vanish completely. It was easier to dismiss the paranormal out loud, easier to fall back on logic. And yet, that gap, the space left when ordinary answers failed, was getting harder to ignore. So they smiled at the ghost idea, and then quietly kept checking vents, wires, pipes, and beams. It became exhausting. The tapping continued every night, and every theory they had unraveled the moment they listened again. Nothing fit cleanly. Nothing explained why the sounds paused when someone shifted in bed and then started again, or why a knock on the wall was sometimes answered in return. The frustration built in equal measure with fascination. These weren't random sounds you could shrug away anymore. They had intention, presence. The family told themselves that one more night of careful logging would give them a clear signal, that one new clue would explain it. But instead, every round of listening collapsed back into the same unease. What should have been a problem with a quick fix was becoming something closer to a riddle. The sort you carry around when there's no clear end in sight. And still, every member of the household was drawn in. Even the tiredest among them felt compelled to listen, to mark the wall, to trade small theories, as though the next idea might solve it. Every logical lead failed, and that made them even more determined. It had stretched on long enough. Which is why, gathered around the kitchen table days later, they realized that speculation alone was no longer enough. A choice had to be made. After weeks of unease building into determination, the family agreed on their next step. They would open the wall. There was hesitation, yes, but the decision carried a weight unlike any of their previous choices. They had exhausted listening, testing, and guessing. Now, only one thing remained: physical proof of what lay behind plaster and paint. They knew cutting into a wall meant dust, cost, and the chance of something worse. Over coffee and quiet talks, the worries came plainly. If it's nothing, we've made a mess for no reason. If it's something serious, repairs won't be simple. But another voice always surfaced. We can't keep living like this, not knowing. In the end, that line spoke the truth they all felt. Curiosity demanded an answer, so they shaped their approach carefully. No hammers through big sections, no reckless swinging. They would start small, choosing a single spot between studs where the markings and sounds had clustered. A tiny cut meant controlled risk, If it led to nothing, patching would be simple. If it revealed something, they'd be ready to know without having torn apart their home. This was the moment they crossed from wondering to acting. It felt a bit like lifting a book's cover to see a hidden letter. Small action, big consequences. What lay beneath that thin surface could be ordinary, or something extraordinary. But either way, it would change what they believed about their home. Preparation became its own ritual. Furniture was moved back from the wall, drop cloths spread wide. They spoke about turning off power to that area just in case hidden wiring was present. Everyone understood their part, even the children, who balanced excitement with the seriousness of the situation. The mood shifted. What had once been casual listening sessions or whispered speculation turned into deliberate preparation, as though they were gearing up for a reveal. For the first time, they weren't just reacting to the mystery. They were stepping into it. No theories, no jokes about ghosts, no temporary comfort in ignoring sounds. This was about action, and action marked a boundary they couldn't reverse. Once that first cut was made, they could never return to the safety of maybe. The family stood together by the marked section of wall, their conversations dropping into quiet. The drywall itself looked unchanged, flat and plain, yet they knew it carried something hidden. That awareness changed how they saw even a blank surface. It wasn't just a wall anymore. It was a boundary between daily life and the unknown. When the tools were finally gathered in the center of the room, the weight of the choice hit them all at once. This was no longer an invisible mystery they could pass off to chance. It was tangible, right there, only inches away. Soon the question would shift from "do we?" to "how do we?" And with that, the focus turned toward what it would take to begin. The first step was practical. They needed tools in hand before anything else could happen. So the homeowner headed into the garage and basement to see what was already there. This wasn't a contractor's job. It was a family effort, meant to open just one section of drywall. He lined up a few essentials: a small drywall saw, a flashlight bright enough to pierce the cavity, and basic safety gear. That was enough for a start. Together, they cleared the space. Furniture was pulled back, drop cloths spread across the floor to catch dust, and surfaces nearby were covered. Each movement carried weight, like setting a stage. What had once been a regular living room was now shifting into a workspace, its calm transformed into preparation. They weren't experts, so they leaned into learning. They watched a few how-to clips, paying special attention to how you cut without tearing too far or striking something important. The plan was deliberate, a small, safe cut chosen where the markings and sounds had built up over time. This was not about rushing. It was about control. The children wanted to help, and in a way they did. One was trusted to hold the flashlight, another to fetch tape or the gloves when asked. Tasks were kept light, carefully chosen so curiosity could be included without risk. The real work would fall to the adults, but the small hands of the children still left their mark on the preparation. Safety was never far from mind. Before even touching the wall, the homeowner switched off electricity to that section of the house. Furniture was already out of the path, outlets checked, and cords pulled free. The space was made clean, intentional, ready for what came next. As the tools came together, the atmosphere shifted again. It wasn't just a drywall saw anymore. It was the cutting edge of an answer. The flashlight wasn't just a beam of light. It was their way into the hidden dark. Even the masks and glasses carried meaning, reminders of how close they stood to something unpredictable. Each piece of preparation made curiosity feel less like wandering, and more like direction. The family stood by the neatly laid out tools, and there was a stillness in that moment. The objects seemed ordinary on their own, but together they pointed forward, toward a truth no longer hidden in silence. Each person could feel the balance between excitement and nerves, the pull of wanting to begin and the weight of what beginning meant. Gathering those tools closed the gap between talk and action. The faint scratching that had once been avoided, the whispers at night that had been rationalized, now had a counterpoint: readiness. Curiosity held shape here, in glove and saw, in flashlight beam waiting to cut through shadow. Everything felt ready. Now it was time to see. And with the preparations complete, the family turned their focus toward the wall itself, where the real test and the long-awaited moment waited just ahead. The family stood together in front of the marked section of wall, tools neatly arranged just within reach. The spot was clear, chosen carefully between two studs where the noises had been strongest, the blue tape still catching the edge of the light. The room felt unusually still, its quiet pressing down with a mix of nerves and anticipation. Every eye fixed on that one patch of plaster, an ordinary surface about to change everything. For a moment, hesitation surfaced. Questions darted through their minds like a rhythm of quiet doubts. What if it was costly? What if it changed everything? What if they opened the wall and found a problem too large to handle? Their shared silence carried all of these what-ifs, but none of them spoke for long. Instead, each person took in the weight of the moment. This was the edge between living with mystery and finally demanding an answer. They whispered about what might be revealed, trying to tether the moment to something manageable. A loose pipe, a trapped nest, the harmless tug of air through gaps in the frame. Those were the hopes, small enough to fix with tools and time. Lurking just beyond them, though, was the fear of worse discoveries: rotting wood, spreading water damage, or something even harder to name. The air seemed heavy with both possibilities, the simple ones jostling against the darker ones in everyone's mind. The homeowner bent down and picked up the drywall saw. Its weight felt plain, ordinary, yet the purpose attached to it charged the tool with something strange. As he lifted it, a sound stirred directly from the marked spot on the wall. A faint scratch, rhythmic and clear. It answered the moment they stood there. The timing froze them in place, a silence dropping across the room as all ears locked onto the noise. The spouse gripped the flashlight tighter, steadying the beam against the surface. The children held each other's hands, shoulders pressed close as if bracing together. Even the dog, until then stretched out in the corner, padded over and stood by, a subtle reminder that even an animal could sense the charged atmosphere. One by one, breaths slowed, focus sharpened. The entire household leaned toward the wall. The scratching persisted, soft but deliberate, like a pulse heard through plaster, not loud enough to terrify, but present enough to demand belief. In that hushed moment, the wall no longer seemed like a dead surface. It felt alive. This was the threshold. Every conversation that had circled around questions, every cautious night of marking and logging had led to this instant. There was no turning back. They were poised between imagining and knowing, between silence and truth. The homeowner raised the saw higher, grip firm now. His family gathered close behind him. The wall would not stay quiet much longer. The saw met the wall with a gritty bite. its edge carving into the marked spot that had carried their attention for weeks. A pale puff of dust rose immediately, hanging in the light like breath in cold air. The harsh rasp of blade against plaster clashed against the softer scratching sounds the family had grown used to, as if one noise was erasing the other. All around him, the household leaned closer, eyes narrowing on a single line spreading slowly across the flat surface. The cut deepened by inches. Dust flaked down, clinging to clothes and settling on the drop cloth below in scattered, chalky fragments. The smell of broken drywall and stale insulation filled their noses. Dry, faintly sour, a smell sealed years out of reach. Each pause was careful, deliberate. He drew back often, listening for the tension of wires or the rattle of a hidden pipe, refusing to rush. The beam of the flashlight caught drifting particles as they floated, making every pause feel suspended in air. Soon the edge of insulation appeared, pink, fibrous, packed tight against the cavity. With gloved hands, he eased it aside, tugging small clumps into a bag while the saw line widened. Threads of fiberglass clung to everything, itchy and stubborn. Behind it, deeper shadows began to swallow the light, revealing the hollow space where the real mystery lay waiting. The hole grew wider, sharp pieces breaking in jagged chunks, adding to the powder on the floor. The flashlight's beam pushed inside now, though it revealed little more than studs, nails, and the uneven dark between them. From somewhere deeper, the noise they had chased for so long had gone still. The room fell heavy with that silence. For the first time in weeks, nothing answered. No scrape, no tap, no faint vibration. The family froze. Dust motes spun in the stillness, the saw resting without motion against the plaster. Their ears, tuned by countless nights of listening, searched desperately for even the faintest repeat. Nothing came. Then, just as they began to breathe out, a new sound surfaced. Not a scratch, not a tap. This was different. Thin, metallic, almost melodic, like a wire gently plucked. It rang quietly from inside the hollow, a delicate vibration that did not belong to wood or insulation. The tone lingered, light but sharp, before fading back into the dark. It was enough to knot their stomachs all over again. Exchange after exchange of quick glances passed between them, each person aware that what they had just heard came closer to something intentional, harder to assign to wind or wiring. In that short shift from silence to tone, the mystery had changed shape. The wall was not just holding noise anymore. It was responding. They stood at the edge of a turning point. What had begun as sounds in the night was now a space they had physically opened. No longer a barrier, this patch of cut drywall became an entry. The family leaned closer, clustered around that rough circle, the flashlight's beam pressing against the dark beyond. And as they steadied their breath, all attention turned toward the opening, waiting to see what the light would finally show inside. The beam of the flashlight slipped into the new cavity, and what it revealed felt immediately strange. Instead of the expected tight framing of studs and insulation, the wall opened into a space far deeper than anyone imagined. What should have been solid construction looked broken into compartments, shapes arranged with purpose, but without logic. None of them recognized the construction. At first glance, it resembled a mixture of workshop and puzzle. A set of rusted springs hung in a neat row across a slim piece of wood, each one swaying faintly when the air shifted. A glass vial dangled nearby from a thin length of wire, its contents long dried into a dark residue clinging to the inside. And mounted against one stud, several small wooden gears, carved and smoothed by hand, turned stiffly when pressed. 3 objects, simple on their own, but together forming the impression of a system hidden inside the wall. The family traded the flashlight back and forth, each eye adjusting to the dim space. The coppery wires wrapped in old cloth insulation stood out clearly, running alongside some of the parts. But there was no neat order. It didn't look like standard wiring or plumbing. It looked older, improvised, and oddly deliberate, as though someone before them had built something secret and then sealed it inside. The children spoke first, their voices hushed but insistent. They wanted to know what the vial had once held, why gears belonged inside a wall, how springs could serve any purpose. The parents had no answers. The father leaned close, brushing a hand along one of the gears. It was firmly in place, smooth from age, yet still sturdy. Whoever had built this hadn't intended it to fall apart. They all expected to see more when the saw opened the drywall. Nests, maybe. Debris. Mechanical parts bundled in a way that felt clearly like a heating vent or old electrical work. Instead, they were staring into something assembled but without explanation. Something designed for function, yet unrecognizable. And then there was the absence. For weeks, the household had grown attuned to every scratch, every small tap and thrum behind the plaster. But with the opening made, those sounds had gone silent. A wall that once clicked and echoed with life now gave them only stillness. Their ears strained against it, waiting for the familiar rhythm, and came up empty. The metallic vibration from before, the plucked tone they had heard during the first cut, lingered in their memory. Looking at the springs and wires, they guessed that might have been the source, but without watching the mechanism move, they could not be certain. They were staring at clues scattered across a half-hidden system, pieces of a design that refused to reveal its purpose at a glance. This first glimpse gave no full answers, yet it shifted their understanding completely. It confirmed that their home held something meant to stay concealed. It wasn't chance noises or imagination. Something had been built, and built with intention. The children crowded closer, the small circle of light steady against the depths of the space. Every person carried the same thought. Something here was meant to operate. But how? And why? They could see pieces of a system, but not yet the thing that made the scratching. They leaned closer, aiming the flashlight deeper into the wall. The gears and springs caught the light, uneven shadows stretching across the cavity. The homeowner reached in, steadying his hand against the frame, and pressed lightly on one of the metal strips. At once it gave off a thin, bright tone, metal singing against emptiness. The sound didn't stop right away, but faded slowly, like a plucked string. The family exchanged glances. For the first time, the strange noises they had hunted for weeks weren't hidden. They were right there, alive in the mechanism itself. Curiosity took over. They began touching other pieces carefully, one at a time. Each responded differently. A spring juddered when tapped, sending out a faint rattle. One wooden gear trembled as if resisting its connection, vibrating until it settled again. The noises were small, yet each matched what they'd once taken for scratching behind plaster. It wasn't creatures. It wasn't random. It was parts, designed to move. Then came the realization. As the air cooled that night, while they lingered around the opening, a rhythm stirred on its own. Small ticks echoed as the metal bent ever so slightly, contracting against its wooden supports. They didn't just hear it, they saw it happen. A strip snapped free with a twitch, brushed another surface, and made the distinct tap they knew so well. Minutes later, another piece shifted, dragging faintly across a stud with the strained whisper they had called scratching. By watching in real time, they built their own explanation. Temperature fell, the materials responded. Metal contracted faster than wood, releasing tension where springs and strips held it. That shift made contact. Contact made sound. It wasn't perfect science, but it fit. They tested the idea further, breathing against one piece to warm it, then stepping back. Sure enough, touched by heat, the strip bent more slowly, delaying its release. What they had called responses to movement or knocks wasn't imagination. Their presence, their body heat, their vibrations, they really did change the timing. The scraps of sound lined up with what the family had tracked on their log sheets. Evening meant quick drops in temperature, so the system came alive more regularly. It explained why the noises clustered at night. It explained why sometimes the tapping came in intervals, almost patterned, and why other times it broke into restless scratching. And it explained why, when they drummed their fingers on the wall, the system seemed to answer back. Vibrations altered tension, releasing a sound in return. One small detail sealed the vision in their minds. Along one side of the cavity, a wooden shuttle sat, balanced against a wire stretched taut. As the cooling continued, the wire pulled tighter, nudging the shuttle forward with a faint scrape. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. That dragging sound was exactly what had haunted their nights. To hear it and see it together eliminated doubt. The wall wasn't random in its voice. It was built to speak through movement and pressure. The relief was real. They could finally put a name to the noises. Yet the clarity carried its own weight. If the sounds came from a mechanism, then who placed it there? Why build something so hidden, so elaborate, only to hide it inside drywall? This wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was design, intentional and secret. And more tellingly, the wires and gears didn't stop where their flashlight beam ended. Pieces continued into the dark, vanishing deeper into the cavities of the wall. The tapping may have been explained, but it was only one small part of what lay beyond. The family stepped back, exchanging quiet looks. Their first mystery was answered, yet something larger, more complicated, still waited inside. If the sounds were only one part of a system, what else was hidden behind the walls? As the opening widened, something much larger came into view. What had first looked like an odd assembly of springs and gears revealed itself as only the front edge of a hidden structure. Behind it were small built-in compartments, carefully crafted, tucked deep inside the wall. These weren't random gaps or casual storage. The work was deliberate, finished with a kind of precision that said someone built it for a purpose. Inside the first compartment they cleared, bundled letters came into sight, tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper had grown brittle, edges yellowed with age, yet still intact enough to hold words from another time. Next to them sat a wooden box with black and white photographs, faces posed stiffly, dressed in fashions the family recognized as decades, maybe generations, removed from their own. Whatever their story was, it had been sealed here to last. In another space, a leather-bound notebook waited. Page after page had been filled in careful handwriting, recording measurements, sketches, even notes on weather and stars. This was no casual journal. It read more like a record carefully observed and meticulously kept. The notebook didn't explain the strange devices, but it deepened the mystery. Whoever once lived here was watching, tracking, deliberately storing knowledge in the walls of their own home. Holding those three things together, letters, photographs, the notebook, the family began to think of the wall as a time capsule. Not an accident of forgotten belongings, but a message folded into the bones of the house itself. Whoever built these hidden places had intended to preserve, not abandon. As they continued peeling back drywall, more of the hidden construction came into view. Someone had fashioned small compartments into the stud space, almost like shelves, some with thin wooden doors. The geometry of it was striking, extending far beyond any typical wall cavity. This wasn't storage born of necessity, but a system with purpose. Every new detail made their home feel less ordinary, less predictable. Then came the most arresting sight. Behind one of the compartments ran a vertical opening, a narrow shaft climbing upward into shadow. When the flashlight beam caught inside, they saw ropes and pulleys still threaded through it, vanishing higher toward the second floor, maybe even the attic. The image was simple, but haunting. Evidence of design stretching through the structure, not just hidden in one wall, but woven through the house itself. That discovery set the earlier mechanism in a new light. The tapping and scratching had not been random at all, but part of something larger, possibly signals or triggers linked to this wider framework. The strange vibration that answered at night might have been more than sound. It might have been a piece of a whole system quietly functioning, even without people present. Each layer they uncovered left them unsettled in equal measure by clarity and confusion. They began with noises, then revealed compartments, then saw a shaft with pulleys that suggested unseen connections. It felt less like prying into a nuisance, and more like stepping into someone's unfinished blueprint, still alive inside the walls. What had started as noise was turning into a hidden workspace, layered through the whole house. The moment hung heavy in the room, because once the scope became visible, each person had to pause and take it in before anything more could be said. The family's reaction came quickly and all at once. The children, wide-eyed, pointed into the opening as though they'd stumbled onto a secret treasure chest. Their questions tumbled over each other. Who built this? Why was it hidden? Could they keep the photographs? One child whispered about secret tunnels. The other speculated about more compartments in other walls. Their voices carried pure excitement, untangled by worry. The adults felt awe too, but theirs was layered with unease. They marveled at the craftsmanship, the way it had stayed concealed for so long. But concerns hovered close. What could this mean for the safety of their home? Would opening these spaces weaken structure? Did this discovery need to be shared with preservation experts, or kept quietly within the family? It wasn't fear exactly, but a seriousness that pulled against the children's wonder. The homeowner found himself caught somewhere between amazement and responsibility, imaging the lives once lived in the same rooms. Whoever had built these compartments was speaking to them in wood and wire, in letters and photographs sealed away. They moved quickly from shock to documentation. The homeowner reached for his camera while the children angled flashlights to illuminate the dark spaces. They photographed everything before touching it, carefully, reverently. Each picture became a preservation of how it first appeared, a record that carried weight. Video captured the springs shivering in the cool air, the faint tremor of gears still echoing against the studs. There was no talk of rushing forward. The act of documenting seemed to settle everyone, as though this moment belonged not only to them, but also to history. That feeling deepened as they handled the letters and the aging notebook. Even without reading every word, the presence of those objects rewrote how they saw their home. They felt connected to whoever had left this behind, an unexpected link across time. What once was just drywall and framing now carried human fingerprints of another generation, lives that wanted to leave something remembered. It was less like renovation and more like opening an unfinished conversation left waiting for them. This connection shifted how the entire family saw their environment. Ordinary rooms no longer looked the same. A hallway wasn't just a hallway. It might conceal another layer. Even the children, usually racing past walls without a glance, began stopping to tap them with fingers, grinning as though more secrets might shake loose. The adults, too, scanned corners and small details they had once ignored, wondering what architectural quirks were purely functional and what might be concealment. The discovery also reshaped the household itself. Weeks of listening together had required patience, but this reward belonged to all of them. It wasn't just one person's persistence answered. It was a shared achievement. And that togetherness, the cooperation of flashlight beams, questions, careful hands, felt as important as the objects themselves. They had turned curiosity into teamwork and found a mystery inside the walls that bound them closer when it revealed itself. In the silence that followed, the family's bond with their home felt altered. It no longer stood as only their dwelling, but as a keeper of stories. They stood not merely as owners, but as caretakers of something larger than themselves. It was a discovery that blurred past and present, making plain that they were only part of a much longer story written into the structure. And with that realization, the next question took shape naturally. If these compartments and hidden mechanisms carried meaning, what history had created them? How far back did this story go? So the family turned their attention outward, looking beyond the wall and into the history of the home itself. They started digging into property records, searching news clippings, and visiting the local archive. Small details began to surface. The framing and joints they had uncovered, along with the style of the hardware, suggested parts of the structure were very old, likely from an era when homes often carried the marks of individual craftsmanship. It gave them a sense that the hidden system was not recent, but tied to an earlier time in the house's life. None of what they found gave a precise date, but the evidence lined up with a period when builders still did much of the work by hand. The hidden joints had been carved rather than machined. The metal parts seemed hammered or forged rather than factory stamped. This wasn't the work of a modern contractor or a quick renovation. It looked like the kind of work left by someone using tools at their own bench. Careful, patient, and personal. As they thought through it, the idea of the hidden system began to feel less like anomaly and more like practice. Different moments in history often encouraged people to tuck things away for safekeeping. Valuable items were hidden, memories preserved, and sometimes projects concealed simply because there was no better place to keep them. They began to think of the wall not as an accident, but as a kind of private time capsule, a space where someone once stored both their work and their traces of daily life. The artifacts themselves pointed to this. The family didn't draw on research to explain it, but instead leaned on what lay in their hands: a small pile of letters fastened with ribbon, fading photographs, a leather notebook, and sketches tucked tightly away. The letters were faded yet still legible. They spoke of ordinary details, notes to other family members, shopping mentions, reminders of weather. The notebook went further. It held precise drawings of gears, precise notes on temperatures and weather changes across days. The photographs, stiff portraits in formal clothing, gave the mystery a face. People who had once inhabited these same rooms but carried their secrets differently. Taken together, these weren't random scraps. They were clues that whoever had hidden them thought carefully about skill, record-keeping, and preservation. These items didn't prove identity, but they hinted strongly at someone curious, an amateur scientist, an inventor, or perhaps a craftsman who paid too much attention to let details slip away. When the family considered the mechanism itself, the strips, gears, and moving shuttle, they realized it fit well with that personality. The odd system seemed to be tracking environmental changes. The small shifts triggered taps, ticks, and vibrations that echoed through wood. That might have been frustrating to later owners, but for the one who built it, the system could have served as a crude record of conditions. In an age before digital devices, it was ingenious in its simplicity. Understanding it this way settled the mystery into a different shape. No longer was it just noise or curiosity. It became a picture of someone who had lived through earlier times, hiding both their experiments and their keepsakes in a place meant to outlast them. The faint sounds had been the final working voice of that private project, still echoing long after its maker was gone. For the family, this shifted meaning entirely. What they held in their hands wasn't trash tucked into a wall. It was a preserved fragment of how someone once lived, worked, and remembered. It stopped feeling like a simple discovery and started feeling like stewardship. And with that sense of stewardship, the question became, what to do next? Because in the days that followed, the family found themselves adapting to a new reality. In the days that followed, the family felt the weight of what they had uncovered. The aftermath was practical as much as it was emotional. Questions surfaced quickly. Should they remove the objects from the wall? Should they consult historical experts? Or should they preserve everything in place as part of the house itself? Those decisions lingered over every conversation, pulling between wonder and responsibility. They chose to begin with what felt most certain: careful documentation. Every compartment and item was photographed from multiple angles before anything was touched. The homeowner sketched the layout of the mechanisms, while the children created handwritten labels for objects, turning the process into a shared project. The find turned into a family project: labels, photos, conversations that lasted weeks. Documentation was not only precaution, but ritual, a way to honor the strangeness they had stumbled into. Each photograph and note gave them a sense of control. The objects themselves remained delicate, but digitizing them meant the discovery could not slip away or vanish with time. This also gave them the confidence that no matter what choice came next, the story of the wall was now preserved. Their lives began to change in quiet but lasting ways. Where once their home was only a daily backdrop, now it seemed alive with hidden depth. The discovery nudged them toward curiosity about history and architecture. They became more curious about construction and local history, seeking out stories of how houses like theirs had been built and reshaped through the years. The homeowner found himself scanning exposed beams in other buildings, noting details of old joinery, or pausing over design quirks he might otherwise have ignored. Even the children had shifted. Questions flowed about how walls were made, why people hid things, and what other secrets might yet wait. Conversations around the dinner table turned richer. What might have been idle chatter about errands now slid toward questions of engineering, family history, and the way everyday objects often carry stories invisible on the surface. The discovery gave them a new language to share with each other, a new point of focus that folded naturally into their lives. The experience also left marks on how they related to each other. Their weeks of listening, logging, preparing, and finally uncovering had forged a bond. The family had met uncertainty together, treated it as something to be faced patiently, and come out with a story that now belonged to all of them. Everyday routines carried echoes of that bond, passing through the living room, leaning against the wall, even vacuuming near the site brought back flashes of the weeks they worked side by side. Over time, the wall itself became a kind of touchstone. It was no longer just drywall. It was the reminder of the night sounds, the quiet teamwork, the first sight of letters and gears and springs. Instead of fading into obscurity, the wall became layered with meaning. The house felt larger now, fuller with stories. What once seemed ordinary had unfolded into something extraordinary, reshaping not only their home, but their sense of themselves within it. That shift mattered most. The simple realization that even the plain walls around them could hold mysteries worth uncovering. And with that awareness, the story opens outward. Because what happened inside this one house carries lessons that might just matter for your own. Some discoveries are extraordinary, but the most practical lesson is simple. Odd sounds in a house shouldn't be ignored right away. This isn't about overreacting. It's about paying attention. If you hear something faint, start with careful listening and small checks. What feels unsettling at first can become manageable when you break it into steps. And those steps can also bring you closer to knowing your home in a new way. The first thing you can do is mark where the sound is loudest. A piece of tape or a pencil mark on the wall is enough. It turns a fleeting noise into a fixed point. Next, note the times it happens. Patterns often reveal themselves only after you see them written out. Then, involve someone else. When another person confirms what you hear or even notices something you don't, the mystery becomes clearer and less overwhelming. Moving slowly through this process shifts the experience. Instead of guessing in the dark, you gather clues. Tapping into your household's combined ears and attention transforms random noises into puzzles you can actually track. Making it a family project turns mystery into memory, just as it did for the people in this story. What could have been dismissed as nuisance became the spark of connection. The same can happen for you. A small sound, when treated with patience, can lead to discoveries you didn't initially imagine. Sometimes they're only practical, maybe loose siding, maybe a pipe shifting. But other times, they hold echoes of history. Think of it like finding a secret note tucked between book pages. The note itself might be ordinary, but the fact that it was hidden there gives it weight. That's how small objects or structures inside a house often feel the moment you spot them. If you decide to move from listening into investigating, your approach matters. Respect the space you uncover. Take photos before you touch anything. Write down details of what you see. Document before you remove anything. Photos and notes preserve context. Even if the object is something familiar, like a nail box or an old tool, capturing its place inside the wall or tucked into flooring gives you the full story of how it was left there. That record is often more valuable than the object alone. It's also worth remembering that the reward isn't only about what you find. The real value often comes from the act of looking differently at what surrounds you. By listening carefully, involving others, and keeping records, you build a relationship with your own home that runs deeper than daily routine. For many people, that change, the ability to see a structure as layered with life and story, is what lasts the longest. In the end, your home may hold more than walls and wires. Every tap, every odd vibration carries the possibility of connection. What you choose to do with it can rewrite how you feel about the place you live. And when the listening slows, when the cutting and searching give way to quieter days, you find yourself settling back into normal life, but never with quite the same perspective again. Returning to regular life came gradually. The family still rose to mornings filled with coffee and school routines. Evenings fell back into homework and chores, and the days began to look familiar again. Yet under that routine, they carried the quiet knowledge of what they had uncovered, and that understanding softened ordinary rhythms with something extra. One of the first practical choices was deciding how to treat the wall itself. It couldn't stay open forever, but it also couldn't simply be sealed up as if nothing had ever been found. They chose preservation over erasing the past. The letters, photographs, and notebook were removed and stored safely, each one recorded and photographed so that its place wouldn't be forgotten. The mechanism itself stayed where it was, gently secured and shielded behind a small, hidden panel that the family could reopen whenever they chose. Fresh drywall closed the section, insulation was replaced, and with a coat of paint, the room regained its familiar shape. But now, behind the surface, a quiet access point remained. The strange noises that had first unsettled their nights ended completely. Once the space was opened and insulated again, the temperature shifts no longer triggered movement in the system, and the walls stayed still. Only silence answered them at night. At first, that lack of sound felt almost uncanny, like losing the pulse of something they had come to expect. But soon that silence became steady ground to rest on, a reminder without disturbance. With the mystery resolved, the family began reaching outward, sharing what had happened. They told pieces of the story to neighbors and friends, cautious about how unusual it might sound. To their surprise, instead of disbelief, it sparked curiosity. Others responded with interest, often adding their own tales about small mysteries from their own homes. These stories spun into longer conversations on porches and at kitchen tables, connecting people in ways they hadn't expected. Their private discovery had become a spark for shared wonder in their community. Inside the family, the discovery turned into shorthand for curiosity itself. "Remember the wall" became a phrase that carried weight, surfacing whenever a child was hesitant to ask questions in class or when a project at home seemed daunting. The children folded the story into schoolwork, turning it into essays and presentations where history, science, and storytelling blended together. The parents carried it too, using the experience as a reminder that ordinary places can hold extraordinary depth. The story gradually settled into their household identity. It became part of family lore, something told and retold at gatherings, each time with new shades of memory added. Instead of overwhelming their daily lives, it slipped in as a quiet layer, enriching their sense of home without taking over. Their house remained the same shelter it had always been, but with new depth in its walls. What began as faint scratching had grown into a shared chapter of their lives, one that reshaped both their home and their relationships. And from there, a broader reflection emerged, one that invites you to consider your own space and what might wait within it. A small curiosity led them to a surprising piece of history in their own home. What began as faint scratching at night revealed hidden compartments, artifacts, and a glimpse into a life once lived inside those walls. Their story reminds us how the smallest details can turn into discoveries with far more meaning than expected. If this surprised you, comment below. Subscribe for more strange, uncanny stories that shift how we see the ordinary. Sometimes, the ordinary contains the extraordinary. If you listen,